Jose, it's an incredible schus to be able to learn with all of you today. So today's daf is daf Vav. Page 6 in Yevamos. We're actually going to pick up on daf Hamid Beis 5b, and we are picking up Ele Itzderich, which is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we left off in the middle of the sugya of trying to figure out why we need the drasha of Eshes, of Achos Ishto, the sister's wife, or the wife's sister, I should say. I'm sorry. Right? Remember again, we had an entire drasha where the Torah, we know, goes ahead and prohibits marrying the sister of your wife. And then we made a gzera shava of aleha, ultimately again to yibum. Now, what's interesting about this is as follows. So one's wife's sister is an Isser Kares, it's an Isser Erva. And yet, amazingly enough, the Torah has to give us a pasuk that yibum in this scenario is Asr. And obviously, if the Torah has to provide a pasuk, that means that without the pasuk, I would have thought that yibum would be mutter even in a situation of an Isser Kares. So the Gemara says, Itzderich, the pasuk of Achos Ishto is necessary. So if you look at Rashi, Sagdai Chamino, Ilo ksiv ale lidrasha, or aleha lidrasha, tisi asay, v'dachilo sasay sheyesh bakaras mikibur avaim. Had the Torah not given us the drasha from Achos Ishto, of aleha, to tell us that yibum is prohibited with one's wife's sister, I would have thought that the idea of an asay being docha elo sa'asay is true even when the lo sa'asay is an Isser Kares. Now, where would I have gleaned that from? So the Gemara says you would have gleaned it from Kibud Avaim. How so? Listen to this case. This time you learned in a brayso, Yachol yehei Kibud Avaim docha Shabbos. One would have thought that the mitzvah of Kibud Avaim, honoring one's parents, should be docha Shabbos. Should set aside the rules of Shabbos. In other words, if there's a clash between honoring my parents and keeping Shabbos, so in other words, or to say a little bit differently, if honoring my parents requires me to go ahead and violate Shabbos, I would have thought that honoring your parents trumps everything, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, I should do that. To which the Gemara says, Talmud lomar ish imo va'aviv tiro ves shabso sai tishmaru. Therefore, the pasuk says a man should fear or revere his mother and his father and keep my Shabbosos. So the juxtaposition here is very interesting. Torah discusses honoring your parents right next to keeping the Shabbos. What does that teach us? Kulchem chayovin bichvodi. To teach us ultimately again that Hashem says, listen, you're obligated to honor your parents, but both you and your parents are obligated to honor me. So therefore, as much as there's an obligation to honor our parents, when there is a clash between honoring our parents and honoring Hashem, such as in a case where my parents ask me to do something that is against the will of the Ribono Shel Olam, so ultimately because both me and my parents are obligated to serve Hashem, the will of Hashem trumps the will of my parents. So the Gemara says, "My love, damle shchotli b'shali." Are we not talking about a case where ultimately, let's say, my father says to me on Shabbos, cook me a piece of meat, right? Or go ahead and shecht for me an animal. So my father is asking me to do a malacha for him on Shabbos, and the Torah says, as much as you're obligated to go ahead and honor your parents, you're more obligated to keep my Shabbos. Now here's what's interesting. The only reason I know not to honor my parents when the will of my parents conflicts with the will of God is because the Torah says, keep Shabbos. Keep Shabbos. So if my father tells me to violate Shabbos as a form, ultimately again, of honoring him, but Hashem tells me to keep the Shabbos, I have to listen to Hashem. But the only reason I know that is because the pasuk says, had it not said that phrase, I would have assumed that the asay, the positive commandment of honoring my parents, goes there and sets aside the prohibitions of Shabbos. Halaf hachidachi. To which the Gemara says, Lo, that's actually not the case. The case is not where my father is asking me to do something which carries with it an Isser Kares, rather top of Daf Vav, Lav de Mechamer. We're talking about a case where, let's say on Shabbos, my father asks me to lead a laden animal. Now, leading a laden animal on Shabbos is Asr, but it's not a Chi of Misa. It's not a Chi of Misa. Ultimately, again, and even in that case, Va'afilu hachi lo dachi. See, even when my father is asking me to do something that's not punishable by death, I still can't violate Shabbos. Even just the law, even just the prohibition, I can't violate Shabbos to honor my parents. To which the Gemara says, Ela de kaimelon, the asya se v'dachi lo sase, ligmar mehacha, de lo litchi. So the Gemara says, 1 second. If that's the case, then when my father tells me to lead a laden animal, I say no. I say no. Why? Because I have an obligation to honor my father. But again, the obligation to honor my father doesn't set aside the prohibitions of Shabbos. Says the Gemara, is this not a proof then that an asay doesn't set aside a lo sa'aseh, right? In other words, doesn't this overturn everything we've been talking about until now? So maybe we're wrong. Maybe our whole premise is flawed. And maybe an asay doesn't set aside a lo sa'aseh. To which the Gemara says, V'chitema, shiny lavi de Shabbos de chamiri. Well, maybe you say no. Maybe in general, asay is docha lo sa'aseh, except in the case of kares. But Shabbos is different. Shabbos is different because Shabbos is very chomer. Right? Ultimately, again, Shabbos is very strict. Shabbos is very stringent. So even though normally we would say that an asay could set aside a lo sa'aseh, when the lo sa'aseh is not punishable by kares or by misa, just the lav, Shabbos is different. By Shabbos, an asay cannot set aside a lo sa'aseh of Shabbos, even though it's just the lav. To which the Gemara says, but yet again, I will say the comparison to Shabbos is made in many other areas to halacha, and no one ever highlights the fact that Shabbos is more chomer than anything else. So we'll see. So first off, if we take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, why is it that Shabbos would be more chomer? Why is Shabbos more chomer than anything else? Look at Rashi. To Kaim Alon, it's in the first of the short lines, Mechalo Shabbos k'ovid avodos kochavim, u'mishum hachi lav greda lodachi u'minayu lo garminan. See, Rabbi say, Shabbos in and of itself is an oath. Shabbos is a sign of our relationship with Hashem. And that's why the Gemara says if a person violates Shabbos, it's as if they're worshipping idolatry, which is such a strong statement. But the idea is that Shabbos serves as the relationship underpinning between ourselves and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the covenant. On Shabbos, when I abstain from engaging in positive, dynamic melacha, work, what I'm showing is Hashem, you're in control. Person violates Shabbos, it's almost as if they're not giving God their due. There's something theologically missing in my relationship. I could be doing everything else. But without Shabbos, is without that basic recognition that Hashem is the creator and Hashem is the one who controls everything. So maybe that's why Shabbos is different, to which the Gemara says, but one second, here's the problem. The problem is there are many times that we go ahead and we make comparisons to Shabbos. And never do we say, no, you can't make comparisons to Shabbos because Shabbos is more chomer. To which the Gemara says, Desanya, for example, Yachol Amarlo Aviv Hitame, Osha Amarlo Al Tachzir Yachol Yishmalo. You might have thought that if your father tells you to become Tameh, now this is about a Kohen. Let's say a man is a Kohen. Obviously, if he's a Kohen, his father is a Kohen. And his father says, I want you to go to this Levaya. I want you to go to this funeral. I want you to go to a cemetery. Now again, my father's telling me to go to a cemetery, but I'm a Kohen who's not allowed to go ahead and become Tameh. Or, let's say I find a lost object. There's a biblical obligation to return lost object. My father says, I don't want you returning it. So here I have a clash between what my father is telling me to do and what the Torah is telling me to do. So you might have thought that Kibud Av Va'im requires me to listen to my father. Talmud Lomar, Ishimo Va'aviv Tiro V'Shabsosai Tishmoru. So interesting, the Pasuk says, a man should revere his mother and his father and keep my Shabbosos. Kulchem Chayovin Bichvodi. All of you are obligated to honor me. So it's interesting. Shabbos is kind of used as the paradigm, the Gemara says. It's used as the paradigm, right? The paradigm is just like everybody's obligated to keep Shabbos, it applies to every mitzvah. So anytime my father or my mother ask me to violate a mitzvah, so you would make a halachic calculation, well, there's an asay, a positive commandment to honor my parents, and there's a prohibition to do whatever it is that my parents are asking me to do. The asay of kibbut avayim shebidocha the lo saseh. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, Hashem says, asay docha lo saseh works, God says, when it's two things I'm telling you to do. But lamaisa, if your parents tell you to do something that's against me, that doesn't work. You can't use asay docha lo saseh, because again, both you and your parents are obligated in the honor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ela mishum dikal mifrach. But rather, again, here's the pircha. Here's why you can't compare malahanach shekein hechshe mitzvah. So here's what's interesting. In the case of Shabbos, what's interesting is as follows. So when my father asks me to go ahead and cook something or shecht something on Shabbos, so there, the very violation is the mechanism through which I would fulfill the mitzvah of kibbut avayim. So when the mechanism of fulfillment of the mitzvah of kibbut avayim is in and of itself a prohibited act, that's when the Torah says you can't do that. It's different though in the Yibum case, because remember, look at Rashi just a moment. Ella, the olam da amrle shachot li b'sheli v'afilu achilo itztirach aleh tikal mifrach malahanach shachot li b'sheli shkenech mitzvah b'chilu Shabbos bakirs. So Rashi points out there is something amazing. Even had the Torah not said aleha, right? Even had there not been, let's say there is a mitzvah of Yibum, there's another way to fulfill the mitzvah. What's the other way to fulfill the mitzvah? With chalitza. In other words, in the case of achos ishto, there is a way to, so to speak, fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum without getting into a biblically prohibited relationship. And that's simply to do chalitza. I'm sorry, I stopped in the middle of Rashi. Rashi says, Ella, li olam da amrli shchot li b'sheli. Right, the case of the conflict between kibbud av v'aim and Shabbos is a case where my father says, I want you to shecht an animal for me, I want you to go ahead and cook something for me. V'afilu hachilo itztir chala di'ikal mifrach. Malahanach shechot li basheli shekin hechshe mitzvah b'chilu Shabbos bakiris lo saseu mekayim asei di kibbud v'zeh hechshe kimo v'yevshel kaim b'lo akiras av. You see, in that case, I can't fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud av without desecrating Shabbos. That's what's happening over there. My father asked me to cook him something. I can't fulfill my father's will without uprooting Shabbos. Hilchach ilo kasav Shabbos osai tishmoru hava aminu litchi. Therefore, the Torah had the Torah been silent and not said anything, I would have assumed, asay doche lo sasay. My father tells me to go ahead and cooking something on Shabbos. I know cooking is also on Shabbos, but I have an asay, a positive commandment of honoring my parents, a lo sasay of Shabbos. The asay of honoring my parents should set aside the lo sasay of Shabbos. Therefore, the pasuk says, Ishimo va'aviv tiro ve'Shabbos osai tishmoru. Yes, you have to honor your parents, but all of you have to keep my Shabbos. All of you have to honor me. So that's why it has to write it by Shabbos and kibbud av v'aim. But in this case, by achos ishto, by the case of the wife's sister, aval yibum lo ze bilvad hachsher kiyuma ha'aseh shar yachol lachlotz v'lo ya'akar lav shel erva v'lo itztir chaleh. Even had the Torah not said aleha, by the case of achos ishto, I could have come up with my own good solution, which is chalitza. Chalitza. In other words, in the case of kibbud av and Shabbos, the clash is inevitable, because the only way for me to fulfill the honoring my parents is to desecrate Shabbos. That's not true in the case of achos ishto. There's a way to take care of yibum even without an iser erva, which is chalitza. To which the Gemara says, El sagadaitcha. So here's the issue. Sagadaitcha mina tisni binyan beis hamikdash. The truth is, I need aleha. Right? Why do I need aleha? Because, in other words, without aleha, I would have thought that asay is doche lo sa'asay even by an iser kares. Now we're trying to figure out why would I have thought that. To which the Gemara says, an incredible Gemara. The Gemara says, this elasach tisi mi binyan beis hamikdash. I would have learned it out that asay is doche lo sa'asay even by an iser kares from the mitzvah to build the beis hamikdash. How so? This sanyo yachol yehei binyan beis hamikdash doche Shabbos. You might have thought that the building of the beis hamikdash should be doche Shabbos. TALMUD lomar es Shabbos osai tishmoru umikdashi tiro. The pasuk says, keep my Shabbos, revere my mikdash. Kulchem chayovin bichvodi. You are all obligated in my honor. So once again, the Torah says, es Shabbos osai tishmoru umikdashi tiro. As much as you have to revere the mikdash, you also have to keep Shabbos. My la bebona v'soser. Now, what does it mean? Isn't the Torah warning us against building and demolishing, which again are avos malachos, primary categories of labor, which if done on Shabbos intentionally, are punishable by kares? Now, the only reason I'm not going to build the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos is because the Torah tells me, keep Shabbos. Halav hachi. Had the Torah remained silent, what conclusion would I have reached? Ilav hachi. Ilav hachi dachi. Had the Torah not said anything, I would have assumed that asay is doche lo sa'asay even by an iser kares. Well, so let me just pause here for just a moment, just so we're keeping on track. Remember, what the Gemara is trying to figure out is as follows. We have a drasha by the case of achos ishto, right? 2 blot ago, or was it on Gimel days, right? We learned that the source for our first Mishnah, that where there is an erva, there's no yibum, and where there's an erva, she exempts her tzara, and tzara's tzara, right? She exempts her co-wife, her co-wife's koi from yibum. And all of that is learned out from the pasuk of achos ishto, my wife's sister. And specifically, there's an extra word in that pasuk aleha, which creates a gzera shava between the prohibition to marry your wife's sister and yibum. Links the two. To teach me what? Just like my wife's sister is usher to me in a regular scenario, she's also usher to me in a yibum scenario. Now, what's interesting about this is as follows. So the Torah is going out of its way to teach me that I can't do yibum in a situation of an Isser Karis. To which the Gemara says that's interesting, because the fact that you had to make that Gzeir Shava tells me that I would have thought that Asay is Doche Lo Sa'asay even with an Isser Karis. So we're trying to figure out, why would you have thought that? So now we're suggesting maybe from Binyan Beis HaMikdash, from the fact that the Torah has to say, Eshab Society Shmor Mitzvah Umikdash Tiro. From the fact that the Torah says, keep my Shabbos, but watch out for my Mikdash, tells me that I would have thought that I could build the Beis HaMikdash even on Shabbos. I would have thought the Asay of building the Beis HaMikdash should be Docha the Lo Sa'asay of building of Malacha on Shabbos, which is an Isser Kares. To which the Gemara says, Lo, Lav de Mechamer. It could be that the Torah is prohibiting ultimately is not binyan and steer, not building, but perhaps it is prohibiting leading a laden animal. This seems to be a favorite. And the Torah is telling me that even a lesser transgression, like leading a laden animal, which is just a lav, just a prohibition, can also not be done on Shabbos for the sake of building the mikdash. Well, if that's the case, then why don't you say we see from here that really asay is not docha lo saseh at all? So you're telling me now that even for the asay, for the obligation to build the Beis HaMikdash, you can't go ahead and set aside Shabbos even with just the lav, even with just the prohibition. Forget about karis, even just the prohibition. So doesn't this show me that asay is not docha lo saseh? So maybe once again you'll say Shabbos is different because Shabbos is chomer, right? Again, like we saw before, like Rashi said, why is Shabbos chomer? Because the Gemara says whoever violates Shabbos, it's as if you worshipped avodah zarah chas v'shalom. To which the Gemara says, here's the problem: but there are many times that the Tana brings up this comparison to Shabbos, and yet never brings up the fact that Shabbos is more chomer. Disanya, it's going across the same thing. Yachol amrlo aviv hitameh. Osha amrlo al tachzir. If your father was a Kohen and he tells you to go to the cemetery, or you find a lost object and your father tells you don't return it, so the Gemara says you might have thought what? Yachol yishmalo. You might have thought there's an assay of honoring my parents. I should listen to my father. To which the Gemara says Talmud lomar ish imo va'aviv tiro. Kulchem chayavin bichvodi. All of you are obligated. So the point over here is you see that Allah so you compare everything to Shabbos, and we don't say that Shabbos is more machmer than anything else. Ela mishum deikal mifrach, but rather again here's the pircha. So we said before, so which we'll say the problem over there, of course, is like we said before, that in order to fulfill kibud avvaim, the only way to fulfill the positive commandment by definition is the commission of the prohibition. The Gemara says, however, shekin hechsher mitzvah tefok lemihasam. Einachinami, that Shabbos society shmor mikdash shitiro lamali. So then, why do I need a Shabbos society shmor mikdash shitiro? Mi baile lechidisanyo. So I must say the truth is, we need that for a different drasha. Listen to this. This is so beautiful. So the Gemara says, Yochol yisyare adam mikdash. You might have thought that maybe there is an obligation to fear the mikdash. So the Gemara says, Talmud lomar. Now, I will say, what's interesting about this is maybe there's a din of yira. There's like a din of being in awe, of being in fear of the Beis HaMikdash. Talmud lomar es Shabbos society shmoru ve'es mikdash shitiro. Ne'emar shmira b'Shabbos ve'ne'emra mora b'mikdash. The Torah uses lashon of shmira, of keeping or guarding by Shabbos, and lashon of mora, reverence by the mikdash. Mashmira ha'amura b'Shabbos amud beis. Just like when it says shmira by Shabbos, what does that mean? Lo mishabbos atam misyare. You're not fearful of Shabbos, right? There's no fear of Shabbos. Ella mimi shehizhir ala Shabbos. Rather, who do I have reverence for? It's interesting. The reverence or the fear is not really for Shabbos. The reverence or the fear is for the one who commanded me to keep Shabbos. Ai the Ribbono Shel Olam. Af mora ha'amura b'mikdash lo mi mikdash atam misyare. Ela mimishi hishir al hamikdash. So too again, says the Gemara, when it comes ultimately again to the reverence about the mikdash, it's not the mikdash that I revere, but rather ultimately again, or fear, but rather it's the one who went ahead and told me to build the Beis HaMikdash that I have reverence for. A really beautiful idea. And the Gemara is highlighting over here that sometimes we kind of lose the trees from the forest a little bit. Right? In Yiddishkeit, it's so easy, unfortunately, to reduce our Yiddishkeit to a series of behavioral or mechanistic physical activities. These are just things that I do, day in and day out, things that I do. And we forget that the reason I do the things that I do is to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara says you don't have to fear a mikdash, you don't have to revere a mikdash. Rather, I should say differently, we do have reverence for the mikdash, we're going to see in just a moment, but the reverence for the mikdash is not a reverence for the building, it's not a reverence for the structure. It's a reverence for the one ultimately who commanded me to build the building. When I go ahead and I do mitzvahs, it's not just the pshat that I'm checking a box. I'm doing the mitzvahs for the one who commanded me to do the mitzvahs, because doing the mitzvahs, performance of the mitzvahs, allows me a connection to my Father. The Gemara says, by the way, ve'ezo hi mora mikdash. By the way, what does it mean to revere the mikdash? How does that manifest itself? Lo yikanis adam b'harabayis b'maklo b'mina alo b'pundaso ba'avak sha'araglov. So ultimately, what's the halacha? You can't come onto the harabayis with your walking stick, with your shoes, with your money belt, with the dust that's on your feet. V'lo ya'asenu kapendario. You can't use the harabayis as a shortcut. Urikika mikal v'chomer, and you're certainly not allowed to spit on the harabayis as well. So, let's just pause on this just a moment. It's actually really profound. Rav Shmuel Hirsch in his Sefer Chorev explains what's the pshat with these items. In other words, why am I not allowed to do these things on the mikdash? And he says, when you come before Hashem, the entire essence of coming before Hashem is sublimation. I'm giving myself over to Hashem. I recognize that, and in Chassidus we call this, bittul. Bittul, there's the yesh, I'm mevatel myself, not a self-negation in a bad way, like I'm a nothing, but I recognize that when I'm in the presence of God, I give myself wholly over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The goal when you are before Hashem is to become wholly dependent and wholly reliant on the Ribono Shel Olam. And says the Gemara something so profound. How do you accomplish that? You don't go into the Harabayis with your walking stick. Rav Hirsch says, the walking stick gives you stability. Your shoes give you stability, the ability to walk, right? When you wear shoes, Baruch Hashem, you don't have to worry about them. My grandmother, Zechron Livracha, was on the death march, spoke about the idea that if you didn't have shoes, you were done. You could go without food, you could go without clothing, but shoes, you could not make it without shoes. So a shoe gives me a certain level, not just of comfort, but of confidence. Your wallet, your money belt. If I've got my money, I've got my credit cards, I've got security, right? So the idea is when you come before Hashem, you give up all of these things. Avak she'al gabe raglov. What does it mean, the dust on your feet? So it's interesting. In the Sifrei Chasidus, they explain that avak she'al raglov is like avak. Avak, we use like avak lashon hara. Avak she'al raglov, dust. Sometimes you have dust on your feet. And the truth is, it's not a big deal. You could ignore it, you could leave it. You have to dust off your feet before you come onto the harabayis. In life, there's like avak, there's dust that we have. The dust are kind of like the little things we do that I know are not good. I know I should not be doing it. Are they the biggest deal in the world? Are they the biggest? Are they just the most horrendous things? No. But I know I shouldn't be doing them. But for whatever the reason, either because, I don't think about it, or maybe I just don't have enough courage or strength or will to be able just to dust my feet off. But when you come to the harabayis, that's the time to make a resolution. I'm getting rid of the avak shal ragel. These are not the big averos. These are not the big things. But these are the little things that often I'm doing day after day or day, right, each and every day, that hold me back from becoming the real person I want to be. When you come before Hashem, you give up your walking stick, you give up your shoes, you give up your money. I'm not independent. I'm fully dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm going to say, Rabbi Silber, I'm coming to you now. I'm going to dust off my feet. I'm going to stop being held back by the little things, the little dust, the particles, the stuff, the schmutz. That's there. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it's holding me back, and I don't want to be held back anymore. So I dust it off. Again, that's just the din of the makom. You can't go ahead and make it a shortcut, and ultimately you can't spit there. I only know that this is true when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. Bizman shein Beis Hamikdash kayim minayin. How do I know that this is true even when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing? In other words, it's actually very interesting. How do I know that there's a din of mora, there's a din of reverence for the place, even when the Beis Hamikdash is no longer standing? Pasuk says, keep my Shabbos, revere my mikdash, Mashmira ha'amura b'Shabbos the olam, just like ultimately Shabbos obligation to keep Shabbos is an eternal obligation. Af mora ha'amura b'mikdash li olam. So too again Mora, which is said by the Mikdash, ultimately again is forever, which is actually an incredible halacha. We know this today, that even those who go up to Harabayas, right, first of all, there are only certain areas you could traverse, and even when you traverse those areas, it requires an incredible amount of vigilance and diligence, incredible number of halachas. So ultimately, again, what's amazing is the juxtaposition between Shabbos and the Mikdash says just as the keeping of Shabbos is something that is eternal, so to the Mora we have to have for the Mikdash is eternal as well. So we'll say, okay, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. But I'll say, I just tell you something very beautiful that I saw. The idea, the Slonimer Rebbe says something beautiful. He says this idea, so we say halacha l'maisa, that ultimately, again, building the Beis HaMikdash is not Tocha Shabbos. It doesn't set aside Shabbos. So the Slonimer says something so beautiful. He says, why is that? Listen to these words. He says, Ki Beis HaMikdash hu makom la'ashras hashchina. He says, ultimately, again, the Beis HaMikdash is a place where the Shechina resides. It's an external, right? It's a building. He says, what's the point of Shabbos? The whole point of Shabbos is to bring the Shechina inside of me. That's the whole point, to create an internal hashras hashchina, an internal resting of the divine. That's what Shabbos is about. Only Shabbos, I daven, beautiful su'udah, learn Torah, sing and dance, and nigga l'chaim. That's what Shabbos is. And what's the whole point of it? The whole point is, I want to bring the Shechina into me. I say, I want you in me. I want you to reside in me. I want to be your home. So says the Slonimer Rebbe, Shabbos is making yourself into a home for Hashem. Beis HaMikdash is building an external physical home for Hashem. So what's more important? Says Slonimer, of course, making yourself into a home for Hashem, of course, is more important. Therefore, says the Slonimer, that's why Binyan Beis HaMikdash is not Torah Shabbos. And what a way to look at Shabbos. Shabbos is the day when I try to make myself into a Mikdash for the Ribono Shel Olam. So if there's a clash between building the personal Mikdash and the national Mikdash, building the personal Mikdash takes precedence. Incredible. We'll say back to the Gemara. So we'll say, remember again, let's go back. The fact that we have to make a limud of aleha teaches me that without that drasha, I would have thought that I say is doche lo saseh even b'makom kares. So we're trying to figure out why would I have thought that. Ela sakadait chamina tisime avara. Listen to this. I might have thought that it's from havara, the prohibition to kindle a fire on Shabbos. Listen to this. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, lo sevar eish b'chol moshe, and the pasuk says you shall not kindle a fire in all of your dwellings on Shabbos. Ma TALMUD lomar. What is this saying? So Gemara says, Ma TALMUD lomar. Either Rabbi Yossi lalav, either Rabbi Nassan l'chalik. Remember again, what do you mean? What is this saying? We learned this already. I will say, here's what's interesting. The Torah goes in and tells you you're not allowed to do any malacha, but then the Torah goes out of its way to say you cannot kindle a fire. You cannot kindle a fire in your home on Shabbos. Why does the Torah single out Havara? In other words, don't say anything. I know I'm not allowed to kindle because remember again, there's a juxtaposition between Shabbos and the Mishkan. Anything done in the Mishkan cannot be done on Shabbos. They kindled fires in the Mishkan, so I already know I can't kindle a fire. Why do you have to explicitly say Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshe sechem yom Shabbos? Why is that necessary? It's machlokis. Tisanya Havara l'lav yatzas de Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi comes along and says Havara, kindling is singled out to say, fascinatingly enough, that whereas every other malacha, if done intentionally, is punishable by misa, kindling is only a lav. Kindling is it's a prohibition. That's why we stated separately. Rabbi Nassan says ultimately again l'chalik. Now what does l'chalik mean? L'chalik means to teach you. Both say one might have thought. Actually, look at Rashi. Rashi says l'chalik shalotomar inu chayiv skila achi yichal Shabbos chum malachos. Both say up until this point in time, the Torah only says all of the malachos in one pasuk. Chum malacha lo sasa. I might have thought the only time you're chayiv skila is if you do all 39 malachas. Therefore, the Torah comes along and specifically articulates, do not kindle, to tell you that each malacha is reckoned separately. It was a famous machlokes. L'lav yatzasa, l'chalik yatzasa. Was it singled out to tell you that it's only a lav, or was it singled out ultimately to tell you that you are chayiv for the commission of each and every independent malacha? To which the Gemara says something amazing. So the Gemara says, Rava says, Tana Moshavos kakashile. The truth is, the problem with the pasuk is the word Moshavos. Torah says, Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshe sechem. do not kindle a fire in your dwellings. So Gemara says, Moshavos ma tamalomar. Why are you using the word Moshavos? What do you mean your dwellings? So listen to this. Michti Shabbos chovas agufi. Remember, Shabbos is a personalistic obligation, right? The obligation of Shabbos is upon me. Chovas haguf, right? The chovas haguf nohages bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. And ultimately, again, anything that is a mitzvah on your guf, on your body, a personalistic mitzvah that you fulfill with your body, that applies both in Eretz Yisrael and out of Eretz Yisrael. Tefillin, right? Mezuzah. All of these are mitzvahs that apply in and out of the land. So Shabbos is a perfect example. Shabbos, how do you fulfill Shabbos? With your body. So because I'm fulfilling, as opposed to agricultural mitzvahs, which are performed with the land, those only apply in Eretz Yisrael. So watch this. Moshavos t'chazer rachmana b'Shabbos lamali. So if that's the case, why does the Torah have to say Moshavos? Why does it say don't kindle a fire in your homes? Well, what does that mean? Mitzvah of Shabbos applies anywhere and everywhere. Mishum Rabbi Silber, so listen to this. Mishum Rabbi Shmuel Amar Talmudecha. So I will say one of the Talmidim said over the name of Rabbi Shmuel something amazing. Lefi shene'emar v'chiyeh be'ish chet mishpat maves v'humas. Pasuk says, if a person transgressed the halacha, a mitzvah, or I should say an aveira, and what happens? They're sentenced to death. What's the halacha? They'll be put v'humas. You shall execute them. If somebody's sentenced to death, you should execute them. Shomea ani bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos. This is incredible. I would have thought that once a person is sentenced to death, that execution should take place whether it's a Shabbos or Sunday. In other words, you execute it as quickly as possible. So if it turns out that the first available opportunity to execute the guy is Shabbos, do it on Shabbos. Umani mekayim mechalaleha mos yumas. But what about the fact that, I remember again, one of the 39 malachos is shchita, right? Is slaughtering. Doesn't that apply to also executing a person? The Torah says, Mechaleh mos yumas, anyone who violates the Shabbos is put to death. I would have thought, Bishar malachos chutz mimisas bezdin. I might have thought that applies to any other malacha, but not what? But not misas bezdin. So I will say, now here's what's interesting. So I just want to point out what's happening over here. If you notice, this is an asay dochalos asay, right? So again, the asay is Torah's telling me to what? To execute someone. If they're deserving of execution, execute them. The los asay is Shabbos, right? And here again, it would be an isser, it would be an isser daraisa, kares. And yet it seems to be the Torah's telling me execute the guy even on Shabbos. Oh, ena ela filu misas bezdin, or maybe not. Maybe at the end of the day, no, you're not. You can't do any malacha on Shabbos, even executing someone. Right, even executing someone. Omani makayim v'humas. So what does the pasuk mean when it says if the guy deserves execution, execute him? B'chol v'lo b'Shabbos. It means execute him during the week, but not on Shabbos. Oh, ena elafilu b'Shabbos. Maybe not. Maybe it means even on Shabbos. Talmud lomar lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvosechem. The pasuk says, do not kindle a fire in all of your dwellings. Now watch this. Ulahalon hu omer. V'hayu eila lochem l'chugos mishpat l'dorosechem b'chol moshvosechem. The pasuk says, all of these things will be for you a mishpat for generations in all of your dwelling places. Ma moshavos ha'amurim lahalon bebezdin. Just like ultimately, again, the moshavos referred to in that pasuk, in that second pasuk, are referring to bezdin. Af moshavos ha'amurin kan bebezdin. So too over here, the moshavos, so I will say, is incredible. The Torah is saying, Lo sivar ish b'chol moshvosechem, is coming to teach you that you can't even quote unquote kindle a fire where? Even in Beis Din. Now I will say, by the way, what does kindling a fire have to do with execution? Because remember again, one of the forms of execution we have is sreifa. The way they would go ahead and perform sreifa is they would melt lead. So that's ultimately, again, that's kindling. That requires a fire, that requires cooking. So ultimately, again, the Torah, so it's incredible. So we're making a gzera shava of moshavos. That when the Torah says, Lo sivarish v'chol moshavosechem yom Shabbos, Torah is still be telling me, don't kindle a fire in your home. I know that. Because Shabbos is a mitzvah on the guf, on the body. So I have to keep Shabbos no matter where I am. Moshavos is talking about even Beis Din. Even if Beis Din has an obligation to execute someone, we don't do it on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Amrachmano lo sevaru. Ultimately, again, the Torah says, do not kindle. Do not kindle. My love, Rabbi Nosini. Damar lechalik yatzas. Rabbi say, doesn't this line up well? Is this not reflective, ultimately, again, of the view of Rabbi Nosson? Right? Rabbi Nosson holds that halacha l'maisa, that remember, Rabbi Nosson was of the opinion of lechalik, right? Rabbi Nosson comes along and says kindling is an iser kares. And the only reason the Torah singled it out was why? Because halacha l'maisa, singled out to teach you that you're chayiv for each and every malacha independently. But this would have been a perfect example. This would have been an asay of execution, docha alosa asay, ultimately again of Shabbos, an isser kares, and the Torah is coming out of its way to tell me, no, you can't do this. You can't do this. V'taima d'kasav rachmana lo sivaru. Torah is telling me don't kindle. So the Gemara says, halav hachi, if had the Torah not said this, ultimately dachi. So we'll say, here it is. Here's an example of where I have an asay dochalo. I would have thought that the asay of executing someone, right, once based and passed the judgment, executing them, that's the asay. I would have thought an asay is docha alosa asay. What's the losa asay? Right, kindling on Shabbos. And I would have thought that it had the Torah not said lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem, Kizeru Shava of Moshvosechem, which teaches me I can't go ahead and execute on Shabbos. But again, without that drasha, I would have assumed I could. Why? Because asay docha lo sasay, and this is true even in asay docha lo sasay, where the lo sasay is an iser kares. Loop this back around. Now I understand why I would have thought that maybe there is an obligation of yibum even with my wife's sister. It's an iser kares, okay, but it's an asay of yibum being docha lo sasay of erva. That's why I need aleha by achos ishto to teach me that no. The same way over here that the Torah has to teach me moshvosechem, that no, you can't go ahead and violate Shabbos for the sake of executing this guy. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, by the way, lo. The time because Rahman lo savara halav achidachi lo Rabbi Yossi v'tehavi. So the Gemara says lo Rabbi Yossi. Halav achidachi. To which the Gemara says lo Rabbi Yossi v'tehavi nami Rabbi Yossi. Emar da Rabbi Yossi havar lelav yatzasa havar gredasa havar debased in bishul psilihi. So ultimately, you're going to both say this is incredible. Remember, this could work even according to Rabbi Yossi, because even Rabbi Yossi, who said that the reason why havara was singled out because it's a lav. So therefore, again, executing someone on Shabbos would really potentially only be the lav. It's not true, because remember, by sreifa, like we just said before, there's two pieces. There's the kindling of the fire, and there's the cooking of the lead, right? Heating up the lead, taking from a solid to a liquid is cooking. That's also an Issa D'Oraisa, right? So that does carry with it an Isser Kares. Even according to Rabbi Yossi, this is a good case. This is a good case. The Gemara says, V'amrav Sheshes Mali Bishul Psila Mali Bishul Samamonim. And ultimately, because Rav Sheshes says, what does it matter? If you're going ahead and you're cooking, psila literally means a wick. It means a piece of lead, or you're going ahead and you're cooking herbs. So both sides. So therefore, we're going to pause over here for just a moment. So I'll just point out something amazing, that ultimately, again, so now we see why, remember, this whole thing was trying to figure out, why do I need a pasuk or a gzeir shava of aleha from achos ishto, ultimately again to yibum, to teach me that I can't do yibum with my wife's sister. In other words, obviously, with the reason I need that drasha is because without the drasha, I would have assumed the asay of yibum is docha the lo asay of my wife's sister, even though that erva is an iser kares. And all we've been trying to show is, why would you think that a positive commandment sets aside a prohibition that has a penalty of kares? To which the Gemara says, here it is. We've given multiple examples. This last one over here says from Shabbos. From Shabbos, I would have thought that the asay to execute someone is docha the lo asay of kindling a fire for the sake of execution. I would have thought that. And again, indeed, that would have been halacha had the Torah not taught me the limud of moshvosechem. So you see that that's the havamina. You see that that's the mindset, that asay is docha lo asay is so strong that a positive commandment can even set aside a prohibition of kares. Therefore, the Torah has to go out of its way in these multiple scenarios to teach me that that is not the case. Although asay is docha lo asay, that is true. At least for now, it's not going to be docha a lo asay, which carries with it a penalty of kares. And again, for us, the reason why this is important is because, again, even though normally yibum is an asay docha lo asay, in the case where the yavama, where the woman falling to me in yibum, is an isser erva, which is punishable by kares, by misa, then the asay of yibum will not be docha the lo asay of erva. Beautiful. Well, I'll just end off with one beautiful ara. You know, Gemara just quoted this machlokes by havara, right? By kindling. Why does the Torah single out kindling? So havara lechalek yatzasa, right? Lelav yatzasa. Well, say if you think about this just a moment, you know, the Svarim bring down that havara kindling a fire often represents kas. Fire represents kas. So I saw something truly beautiful brought down in the name of, did I see it in the name of, I'm going to find it, 1 second, I'm sorry. In the name of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh brings down something amazing. So Havara, kindling represents Kas. The Rebbe said Kas, what does it do? L'chalik, it divides. So what does it divide? Here the Baal Shem Tov says something so beautiful. It divides in 2 ways. Number 1, it divides people, which is obvious. You get angry at someone, you create divisiveness. We're not together. It divides. But says the Rebbe something amazing. It also divides between the guf and the nefesh, the body and the soul. When a person gets angry, they lose sight of their ruchnius. When a person gets angry, they lose sight of their neshama. When I get angry, my animalistic, almost tendencies and behaviors, they kick in. Havara, kas, lechalik. It pulls apart the neshama and the guf. My whole life, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to keep my guf in check. I'm trying to create a synergistic partnership between body and soul. I want my body to be the vehicle of my soul, not to be the enemy of my soul. I want my body to do incredible things. But in order to do that, the soul has to be the dominant partner in that synergistic partnership. The soul has to be the dominant voice. The soul has to be in the driver's seat. And you know what's so dangerous about anger? L'chalik. It divides the heart. It divides the neshama and the guf. It pulls apart the neshama and the guf. And when the neshama is pulled out of the guf, chas v'shalom, there's no telling what terrible things the guf could do when it is not being steered and not being directed by the neshama. So we have to be so careful with anger. There are times where anger is warranted. There's time where kas is appropriate. But even when kas is called for, even when it's appropriate, it must always be measured. And it must always be contained, like a fire. Fire is very positive and very profound and very good if it's contained in something. If left unchecked, fire destroys. When we have to get angry at times, it has to be controlled anger, limited anger. Because if not, we run the risk of of pulling apart chas v'shalom our guf and our neshama, and then unfortunately terrible things occur. An incredible mussar for us to be so careful with our midos, to be so careful with our anger, to be so careful when our passions run high, when we're ready to get angry. Just be careful. Do I really want to pull apart my guf and my neshama? All right, Chaver, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with you in person, but it's a great zchus to continue to learn with you. Have a wonderful day.